are back. This is episode number 74 of Calibrated with Scott. I'm Scott, of course. I have to apologize to all of my fans and followers. I have been AFK for almost 2 weeks now. I've had a pretty difficult couple of weeks, a lot of it not so good, been extremely busy, life just kind of hitting hard. So I do apologize for anybody who relies on me for updates. I feel like I've let you down, and I'm horribly sorry for that. But I'm back. I'm going to try to do this more often. I love doing this. It's like one of my favorite things. So here we are. Let's get right back into it. And we have quite a bit to talk about. Like I said, I haven't been here for 2 weeks. So we have some updates to go over. And I'm going to start with the area where everybody's probably most interested in, and that is Avdeevka in Ukraine right now. On the Donetsk front, the Russians around October 9th, I believe, went on the offensive in this area. And there has been quite a bit of progress since the last episode I did with you guys. I'm going to put up a picture right here of the current situation around Avdeevka. This comes to us from Rybar. You can see that there is a widening zone of control around the quote-unquote waste heap, which is this large industrial hill that the Russians took a while back. I talked about it in my last video. This industrial hill is extremely important. It is the high ground that overlooks the Avdeevka coke plant, which is a chemical plant, a large chemical plant that serves as a strong point for the Ukrainians. It also overlooks the small town of Stepove to the northwest, northwest, I guess you would say. And you have progress to the south around Spartak, and that is basically the gates of Avdeevka right down here. There's not a ton of movement on the southern flank. I think that this area is one of the most difficult for the Russians to progress in. It's just a wide open field, basically, with tree lines here and there. So it's incredibly difficult for attackers to push through this area, and that's why we haven't seen a ton of movement. But I'm sure that the Russians are continuously, day by day, assaulting Severne, which is in the south. And once that town falls, again, that's sort of a wrap for Avdeevka. We are at a position right now where Avdeevka is in this salient. It's been in a salient for quite some time, but the recent Russian advances, especially on the northern flank, have really started to put immense pressure on the AFU garrison in Avdeevka. And we'll post up the frontline picture right here on the northern flank. This is my own rendition of the front line. The red line is everything that the Russians have control over and have consolidated. The purple that you see on the corner down by the waste heap and around Stepove is area that I would consider newly Russian gained, so non-consolidated or potentially gray zone. It's kind of hard to tell. The situation is so dynamic and fluid. The Ukrainians counterattack, the Russians attack. It's this whole mix up in this area, and it's very difficult to kind of put your finger on where the Russians exactly are, but they are in this general area, and this front line is very close to other mappers like Deep State, Syriac, and some others. So I think that this map is pretty accurate, and what it shows is that the Russians have completely expanded their control out around Krasnohorivka, and that has allowed them to push up against the rail line, which for anybody who doesn't know, especially in Ukraine, there's not a lot of high ground and there's not a lot of natural barriers anywhere. It's flat steppe for the most part, right? So this this rail line is basically like a large earth formation, because rail lines are usually like this, kind of like up on a little mound. That's where the rail line is, and the Russians can use one side of that to peer over. It's sort of acts as a high ground. It's a good defensive position. And just in general, rail lines are where you'll see front lines start to sort of level, because crossing rail lines is also extremely difficult. Vehicles have a hard time crossing rail lines sometimes, and just the focus of fire crossing a rail line can be incredibly difficult. So the Russians have crossed over. They are now in Stepove. I think that they have completely captured Stepove. the Ukrainians have left this area, so I do think it's open. And this is incredibly important because now the Russians will be able to, pull out a flanking maneuver and rotate down onto the flank of the coke plant. And the coke plant is like the single most important area to the defense of Avdeevka. If that falls, the main supply route in and out of the city will basically be cut by direct line of sight fire coverage, and that'll be the end of the easy supply, or not easy. I guess the situation is not easy for the AFU, but the more stable supply situation for the AFU garrison in Avdeevka. This battle is different from Bakhmut in some ways, and it's similar to Bakhmut in a lot of ways. So I'm gonna kind of dive into that a little bit. Bakhmut was a much bigger city. I don't think a lot of people understand that. They just kind of hear a city name, they see it on a map, they don't have a scale or reference. Avdeevka is much, much smaller. It's something like a third of the population of Bakhmut, and it doesn't have nearly the high-rise situation that Bakhmut had, which gives a big advantage to the defenders who are sitting atop of these buildings, these high rises. It acts as an unnatural high ground in a particularly flat area. So approaching these buildings is extremely difficult, and it's Soviet construction. So they are rock solid concrete all the way through and through, and they can take tank shells, bombs, all sorts of different stuff and stay standing. So they are particularly good strong points. Avdeevka doesn't have nearly the number of these as Bakhmut did. Avdeevka also does not have Soledar, which was the town that's actually closer to the size of Avdeevka, up to the north, nor did it have, New York to the west and Chasiv Yar to the rear. That whole situation basically means that Avdeevka is isolated from stable, safe logistics. The Ukrainians used Chasiv Yar as this secondary fortress behind their primary fortress, which was Bakhmut. And that's how they kept that battle going for nearly, I think, 9 or 10 months. They just were able to bunker down, keep supply moving in and out. And even as the Russians wrapped all the way around the rear of Bakhmut and they were on one of the last two remaining supply routes, the Ukrainians just had the high ground in Chasiv Yar. They could shell the Russians. A lot of Russians died on these two flanks because of the situation. They are sitting there on the low ground trying to disrupt supply, and the Ukrainians are just taking pop shots from Chasiv Yar. Avdeevka does not have that. Another difference between Bakhmut and Avdeevka is the overall geographical size. And I know I mentioned size earlier, but I talked specifically about population. Bakhmut is much more spread out. There's a lot more area to fight. Avdeevka just doesn't offer that. I'm going to put up a picture here of the different areas of Avdeevka, and I'm going to explain them. So here you have Zone A and Zone B, I guess. They're part of the same bigger zone, which is the red zone. The two red zones that you see on your map, A, B, and C, are all the high-rise industrial areas, the areas that are much more defensible, right? The yellow area that you see on your map is all suburban housing, so not very good for defense. They get shelled, everybody inside dies. They're not the best for strong points. And the Russians are bordering both C to the bottom. They've actually pushed into C a little bit, into the industrial zone down in C. And they are right up against A, both to the west and the north. North? It's hard to tell on this map. I think it's northwest, on the waist heap. So the Russians are already at the gates of the defensive points, whereas in Bakhmut, the Russians had to approach the gates and approach these high points. And it took a very, very long time for the Russians to do this, and it cost them a lot, particularly in their prisoners, that Wagner utilized for assault troops. Though a lot of those guys died in these attacks trying to make the approach to Bakhmut. That's not the case in Avdeevka. Avdeevka has always been right on the front line, right up against Donetsk. So that's pretty significant. If you look at the blue line that's coming into the town, that's the last remaining super safe supply route. Everything else around it gets shelled or is under direct line of sight fire. That is the last main supply route running in and out of the city. That is the lifeline of Avdeevka. So you can see that as you would take maybe from the north, the coke plant, once you take that coke plant, the main supply route into the city has been cut off, right? If you go into B, which is harder to approach, B is what I would recommend calling the Citadel. That's what we called it when the Bakhmut fight was going on, the battle for Bakhmut. The Citadel was basically commie blocks. So, apartment buildings, 8-9 stories high, that offer good defensive points, and they're just built like fortresses in and of themselves, which is interesting. The Russians are knocking at the door. There's not a lot of space for the Ukrainians to make mistakes. There's not a lot of space for the Ukrainians to push in reserves. There's just this whole battle is very, very different from Bakhmut. Bakhmut was extremely advantageous for the Ukrainians. That's why they lost so many men trying to defend it, and then so many men trying to take it back through June, July, August, September, October, and now we're into November. And in November, the Russians have actually returned a lot of these gains, but we'll talk about that later. I'm going to finish up with Avdeevka real fast. I wanted to show you guys the street views. So from A, which is the coke plant, I wanted to show you this view just so you guys can get kind of an idea of the situation on the ground, what the Russians are dealing with, what the Ukrainians are dealing with, and sort of just like, the layout. We always are looking at satellite pictures. It's hard to see what's happening on the ground and how the actual minutia of the battle is taking place. So here's that video of the coke plant. As you can see, very industrial. And then once you turn your back to it, this is on the very corner edge of the coke plant. You can see how it's just open fields, right? Open fields with like tree lines maybe, but nothing significant to approach this area. So it's very flat, and the coke plant offers great defensive positions. Now, if we look down at B, this is the second street view I have. This street view is of the, I guess you would call them commie blocks. I'm spinning around here. Once you see the outside, you notice that it's kind of the same thing. You have these flat fields, sparse tree lines, and that's about it for cover, right? And there's a MiG-17 there, another MiG-17 statue like we saw in Bakhmut. So it's going to be another one of these things where the Ukrainians are probably going to blow up the statue before they leave because they can't let the Russians, for whatever reason, make it to that statue in one piece. And, either if A or B falls, Avdeevka's done, right? There's no defending a little strip of territory. It's super unadvantageous for the Ukrainians. This defense is incredibly difficult, and we're beginning to see a lot of talk about the Ukrainians pulling out from the garrison, which I don't think is going to happen. That hasn't been their MO this entire war. I don't see that happening. That would be beneficial for them, I believe, because I don't see how Avdeevka ends any other way than the garrison being torn apart, either as they get routed out of the city or as they fight to the death in the city like they did in Soledar. And it just doesn't offer the same defenses once the Russians got around the back. Avdeevka is a fortress city. They have concrete bunkers, they have tunnels, they have everything. And that's great, when the Russians were stuck in, or, they weren't Russians at the time, when the Ukrainians that were the separatist Ukrainians were stuck in Donetsk, right? Once the Russians made advances on the northern flank, the northwestern flank, they captured Kamyanka and Krasnohorivka. After that happened at the beginning of the year, or earlier in the year, the whole situation had pretty much been sealed. I mean, the defenses were not designed to protect from this direction, and you don't have really, the Ukrainians don't have the resources to continue building these massive fortifications like they did over the 9 years or the 8 years of peacetime. So Avdeevka is cooking. The boiler is running hot, and I give the city a couple months at the most, depending on how much Ukraine throws at it. If they decide that this is going to be their final stand, sort of like they did with Bakhmut, but without that spare army in reserve, then they could make it go a couple more months. But it's going to be a horrible, horrible decision, a horrible battle strategically for the Ukrainians. And it will probably be one of the last major battles if that's how they choose to go about this. Avdeevka has some pretty major significance to the Russians and to the people of the DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic. This area is where shelling often occurs on the city of Donetsk, where civilians get hit, where the Ukrainians have notoriously openly fired against civilians, kind of randomly firing at civilians in Donetsk, and have killed a lot of innocent people. And so there's a lot of resentment, a lot of hate. Avdeevka is one of those things that once it's accomplished, everybody's going to breathe a sigh of relief, because the artillery guns will be out of range of Donetsk for the most part. And once that happens, that whole area becomes a much better logistics point for the Russians to jump off of. So Avdeevka falls, and then the Russians have Donetsk, and they can start utilizing Donetsk for their logistics for these places and not put civilians in danger from, certain strikes, especially artillery strikes. And that's, if you take the Russian word for it, which you don't have to, they have said that they try their hardest to keep any military out of the heavily civilian areas of Donetsk to prevent that exact same thing from happening, but it doesn't matter because the Ukrainians continue to shell it. I wanted to move on from Avdeevka to Bakhmut, like I talked about earlier. Bakhmut has seen a reversal in almost all of the Ukrainian progress on the northern flank, and on the southern flank, the Russians are pushing very hard for Kleshchivka, which the Ukrainians recently took in August or September, I believe, in totality. I would like to remind everybody that the battle for Bakhmut ended in May, right? With the Russians winning, the Ukrainians retreated out of the city. The Russians pushed up, and they were high up on the flank. And then over the months of June, July, August, September, the Ukrainians threw a lot of resources at Bakhmut to try to recapture it. I believe they did one pincer on the top, one pincer on the bottom, trying to get around, and these just did not pay off. They lost a significant amount of men and material in these assaults. They were gaining 100 meters here a day, here and there after each assault. It was just not worth it, especially considering they had another failing offensive going on in Zaporozhye that didn't have necessarily all of the resources that it could have had, because the Ukrainians were still pushing so hard around Bakhmut. Maybe they thought the Russians were going to have to pick one to really, really, stop, and then the other one, they were going to make some progress. That just never happened. The Russians had far, far too many mobilized reserves that they could move into battle and place everywhere like chess pieces. And the Ukrainians really only had a few brigades that were in reserve, ready to exploit opportunities or, reinforce failure, I guess, which is what ended up happening. And these brigades were even more reduced by the fact that there was some serious fighting going on in Kupiansk. That's where the CV9, the Swedish CV90s ended up going originally, and then they ended up getting transferred to Bakhmut later. And around, Ugledar, Kherson, the Ukrainians tried to push so wide and far, and they'd never accomplished anything on any front. Now, I'll post up this map. You can see on the northern flank, the Russians have almost completely reversed all of that advance that Ukraine had made since June on the northern flank. And down here on the southern flank, you can see the Russians are slowly pushing the Ukrainians back out of Klishchivka. And, the loss of Klishchivka would basically cement the Ukrainian counteroffensive as an absolute complete failure, especially if the fortified position that is now controlled by the AFU to the north is captured. I actually don't know how well that fortification works now after it's been shelled so consistently for about a year. But it's still there. And so I'm going to maintain that this is an important trench line that overlooks Klishchivka and overlooks places like Ivanivsky and Bakhmut. But outside of that, the Ukrainians just don't seem to be able to put anything together properly right now. They rushed the 47th Brigade to Avdeevka, which had been a part of the Zaporozhye offensive. That brigade was not refitted properly. They were filled up with mobilized infantry, which are not very well trained, and they were sent into Avdeevka and they got kind of slaughtered. I'll post up a video here that gives a geolocation around, it's in Stepove. And this is a Bradley that came into this position to fire on Russian positions. And then as it was leaving, it was struck by a FPV drone. And then shortly after, in the same video, you can see multiple Bradley losses and multiple Leopard losses. In fact, in the north of Avdeevka, on the northern flank, north of Stepove even, the Ukrainians have talked about how they've lost about 7 Leopards in a week. So those are pretty massive losses for the Ukrainians, and we're just going to have to give it time to see if we actually ever see those losses, but it is what it is. The 47th Brigade is probably combat ineffective at this point after being, bashed up against a wall in Zaporozhye and then rushed in to bash up against a different wall in Avdeevka. And that's not a good sign for the Ukrainians. When you're pulling non-refitted brigades and throwing them into combat right away, exhausted and damaged, you're not going to yield any good combat results, and you're doing that out of desperation. And it's not just Bakhmut and Avdeevka. The Russians are also reversing gains in the Robotny area. They are reversing the previous Kharkov offensive gains in the Oskal bridgehead, which the Ukrainians are still suffering extremely high losses in all of these areas. And it just can't continue forever. We've gotten to the point where Western-backed news agencies, mainstream media, politicians are all sort of saying the same thing. Ukraine needs to negotiate. It's time for Ukraine to negotiate because the West cannot continue providing the level of support that it needs to, especially considering what's going on in Gaza right now. And they don't have the ability like Russia does to put itself on a war footing to, jumpstart its economy and start producing all of these shells. The EU had claimed that they were going to deliver, I think, 1 million shells to Ukraine. I think that number is only around 270,000 so far, which that was supposed to be by the end of the year. That hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. Anybody who with a brain could have told you that that wasn't going to happen. They had set a goal for 55,000 shells a month by 2024 or into 2024. And they are looking at something around 37,000 shells, which is not much more than they were producing previously. So, you're starting to really come up against the industrial capabilities of the West, the military industrial capabilities of the West. and their ability to, sustain a long attrition-based war, which the Russians are fighting and winning against the Ukrainians right now. And it's not just Western politicians. Zelensky is now crawling. I mean, every statement he makes. Today, he talked about how the Abrams were not effective because they did not send enough of them. We never even saw Abrams on the battlefield. So he's already talking about how the Abrams was a failure, and we haven't even seen them on the battlefield. We have people like Oryx, who has retired, who was a big, I would call him propaganda piece for the Ukrainians. He counted a lot of Russian losses. He counted a lot of Ukrainian losses as Russian losses. His list has been debunked multiple times. And I'm not saying that all of it is fake. There is definitely Russian losses on that list, but the numbers are just astronomical and ridiculous. We are steadily now approaching winter. The Russians are in a position where they can bring something to the table for the Ukrainians to negotiate. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to negotiate at all. They seem to be on their own now, away from the US's direct, attention in the way that they are approaching talks, the way that they're doing a lot of the different things that they're doing. And with the winter approaching, cold temperatures start approaching. And with the cold temperatures, the Russians are likely going to start another infrastructure campaign against Ukraine. And this time, the Ukrainians do not have the level of support that they had last year. They do not have the financial support. They are not going to get the industrial support to repair their grid from these strikes. If the Russians are more aggressive with these strikes and actually target the power facilities instead of just the substations, the generation instead of the dispersal, then it could be catastrophic for Ukraine. I don't know if the Russians are going to do this just because of the way that, the narrative that they're kind of building, that Ukraine is not supposed to be destroyed. It's supposed to be changed for the better. And that's what the Russians are trying to do. But if you want to win a war, sometimes you got to crack some eggs. And I think we probably will begin to see a large missile campaign against Ukraine's infrastructure in the coming weeks and months. As soon as those temperatures drop below zero, it'll start. And when it starts, you will know because it will be probably weekly strikes. I don't know if they're going to do a large, salvo to start it off. I don't know how it's going to begin. But we are already seeing a large concentration of Russia's strategic bomber fleet now has been moved to Engels Air Force Base, where it had been transferred away from just for safety purposes because Engels is in range of some Ukrainian weapons. And these planes are now on the base, and that appears to be a good sign that there's going to be a large missile campaign very soon. And it makes sense because the Russians used Kerch Bridge last year as an excuse to strike Ukrainian infrastructure. This year, the Kerch Bridge was struck again. It's already been repaired, but it is on the docket. I made a post about this on Twitter a while back that Russia has just been gifted the go-ahead to, redo the winter campaign again, and Ukraine is not in the same position they were in last year to deal with it. So that's coming up. That's something that people should be paying attention to. Down in Kherson, there's been a lot of noise about a Ukrainian bridgehead. It's nothing. I want to reiterate this because I have this conversation a lot. There is nothing beneficial about what the Ukrainians are doing in Kherson. They have crossed the river in some manner. They have always been kind of across the river because the estuary that the Dnieper River is located on around Kherson is spotted with these, swampy islands. And the Ukrainians just island hop, and the Russians kind of sit back right where that estuary ends. And that's where their defensive lines are set up. That's where the first cities are located, first villages and towns. And that's where the Russians have their defenses. So the Ukrainians push in, They make a little bit of progress and then they get pushed back out, and their losses are heavy. It's almost impossible in this day and age to keep a bridgehead across a river that wide supplied very easily. And it's 100% impossible for the Ukrainians to actually achieve some sort of strategic success on that side of the river, considering that the Zaporozhye offensive has already failed. Their focus is on Avdeevka, but they're still wasting manpower and resources on crossing the river. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what they're doing. Don't know why they're doing it, but that's where we are. Other than that, I think I'm going to wrap it up here today. Keep it a little short. On the next video, I will be answering Patreon questions. I'm hoping to do another video tomorrow. I actually found some time now, so I can actually get more of these videos out. I really appreciate everybody who has stuck with me. I'm sorry about this 2-week hiatus. Life just got slammed. You know, if you like my work and you want to support me, you can go donate to me on Patreon. If you donate on Patreon, you are allowed to ask questions that will be answered, like I'm saying I'm going to do in the next one. I just did not have them ready to go for this episode. And follow me on Twitter and Telegram. It's the easiest place to get all of the news all of the time. I'm constantly on there posting, so go give those a follow. And until next time, thanks, guys.